they're both shores and are fighting it, you know what I mean?
I didn't call up the bad weather in the south or the bad weather in Millbriar. And actually, some of the reports coming in from Alabama are pretty alarming. But it's probably no more appropriate or provocative way to start an afternoon with Bill McKibben as our speaker than to realize that our atmosphere has basically all this extra energy that is being played out in very alarming ways on the human species and nature every day. Bill McKibben's the human scholar at Middlebury College, but really is best known as being a writer. Grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, and I think it's probably his first sort of milestone on his incredibly distinguished career was being president of the Harper Crimson during his undergraduate years. He was a writer and editor and writer for the Talk of the Town page of the New Yorker for a number of years, and still contributes regularly to the New Yorker and Harper's and Atlantic Monthly and Orion and other magazines that many of us that read about the environment want to make sure pass through our hands every month. Most importantly, a few years ago, he wrote a book called The End of Nature. Normally a book like that, you sort of sit down and prepare to be depressed. And I suppose there is a lot to be, I won't say depressed about, but thoughtful about in a book like that. Widely recognized as the first book written for a general public audience on climate change. Time magazine has called him the planet's best green journalist for his various writings in magazines and a variety of books, now I think numbering 12, including The End of Nature. And most recently, I think all of us know Bill McKibben as the organizer of the grassroots movement 350.org. Got off the ground just a few tens of months ago, I guess, maybe a year or so now, in an effort to alert the population of this country and the world that when we go beyond 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we really do it at our own peril. I looked at the Cary weather station printout on my computer just before coming over here this afternoon, and it read out as 392. We're already into dangerous ground, and I'm sure Bill will cover a lot of that today. So, Bill, we're incredibly lucky to have you passing through this area today. I know we've wanted to have you speak at the Cary for a long time. It finally worked out, and we're just honored to be able to welcome you here. Thanks.
What a pleasure for me to be here. Now, I've spent most of my life in the upper reaches of the Hudson watershed, living in the Adirondacks. So, of course, I've from time to time stumbled over people from this institute out doing good things, conducting research, working on various educational programs. It's great pleasure to get to see the thanks for all that. All kinds was one of the most interesting. In fact, my guess is that when people look back on the history of the 20th century, the invention of the idea of ecology will prove to be one of the 2 or 3 most significant things that happened in that century. Probably more important than cracking the atom or the other things that we think of as so crucial at the moment. But the kind of abstract interest and importance of all that work has in the last few years come into very sharp focus as we take on the first truly difficult global ecological problem that we've ever had to deal with, this issue of climate change. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I apologize in advance for the fact that my work is generally kind of as a professional bummer outer of people, and that's just how it goes. I will try to end on a more hopeful note. But we're going to start. We're going to start in the valley, and we might as well start, in the last 48 hours. My last book, Earth, was kind of bookend to that first account of climate change, The End of Nature, that came out in 1989. And when it came out, we knew the basics of climate change. We knew that when you burned coal and gas and oil, you put CO2 into the atmosphere. And we knew that the molecular structure of carbon dioxide trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to the planet. Though complicated in its details, it's not complicated really in its basics, this problem. Really, the only thing we did not know 20 years ago was how fast this was going to pinch. And the story of the last 20 years is it's pinching harder and faster than we had thought. A lot harder and a lot faster. My last book, the sort of bookend of this, was this book with the strange title, Earth, spelled E-A-A-R-T-H. The conceit was that we'd already taken the planet into a new place, that it was different from the one that we were born on to. I spent the grim first chapter of that book, adducing a great number of proofs of this, which I won't bother you with. Suffice it to say that the year since that book came out, it's been about exactly a year, has sufficed to prove the case yet again. 2010 was the warmest year for which we have records. 19 nations set new all-time temperature records. Some of those records were extreme. We were talking with our 350.org colleagues in the country of Pakistan in late June. And one of them said on the phone, "It's very hot here today." And I was surprised to hear him say that because it's normally hot in Pakistan in June. And he said, "No, it's really hot here today. We just set the new all-time Asia temperature record. It's 129 degrees outside today." That's hot. Take the hottest day we had in the Hudson Valley last year, add about 30 degrees to it, and then for 98% of Pakistanis, subtract all the air conditioning, and you get some idea. Now, when you have heat like that, it causes lots of things to happen, and lots of things did happen. The Arctic continued to melt at a prodigious rate. The fourth year we've seen that kind of melt. Both the northwest and northeast passages were open simultaneously. There was a yacht race last summer around territory that even 10 years ago we thought no human would ever be able to navigate. You saw what happened in Russia when a heat wave of absolutely epic proportion had never reached 100 degrees in Moscow in 250 years of record keeping. It was above 100 degrees 8 days in a row in August. That set off a great number of fires and things, but what it really set off was sort of alarm bells within the Kremlin. They got so scared about their grain reserves that they stopped all export of grain to the rest of the world, turned ships around. That caused the price of corn and wheat to jump about 70% almost immediately on world markets because Russia's the third biggest grain exporter in the world. And that in turn means that there are lots and lots of people this afternoon all over the world, probably 1 billion or 2, who are eating less than they would like to be because they simply can't afford it at the price that it now is. Maybe most dramatically last year was what we saw happen in place after place. Dramatic flood events on a scale that we haven't really seen before. And these are precisely the things that climatologists have been warning us about for a number of years. Warm air holds more water vapor than cold air does. That's maybe going to turn out to be the most important physical fact of this century. Okay? It means that you get more evaporation in dry areas, but once that water is up in the atmosphere, it's coming down. The atmosphere is about 4.5% moister than it was 40 years ago on average. That loads the dice for flood, and a number of places threw snake eyes, as it were, last summer. Most powerfully, those pictures from Pakistan, where that territory up in the Khyber Pass that normally sees about 3 feet of rain in a year saw 12 feet of rain in a week in places in the middle of the summer. That was enough to swell the Indus, the river that drains through Pakistan, to the point where it covered at its height about a quarter of the country in water. The Red Cross said recently there are still about 4 million homeless people in Pakistan as a result of that storm. There have been similar events in Queensland in Australia, in parts of Brazil, in Sri Lanka, in Vietnam, in the Philippines, mega floods on a very large scale. It's no longer only scientists who are calling our attention to this sort of thing. Munich Re, the world's biggest reinsurer, put in a statement at the end of the last year saying the only plausible explanation for what we see in our record of payout and casualty loss and things is the onset of climate change. And that brings us to the last few days around this country. Right now, as we speak, they are indeed sifting through the wreckage in the south. They think 260 to 280 people at least are dead from the last couple of days, and probably the largest property damage ever recorded from a tornado outbreak. It's the third biggest tornado outbreak on record. There have been 2 of these giant outbreaks in the last 10 days. This is the first time that we've ever had tornado outbreaks like that, as close together as that. At the moment, there have been far more tornadoes to date this year than any other year for which we have records. Meanwhile, in the middle of the country, the Mississippi is swelling at the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio at Cairo in Illinois. They're going to set a all-time flood level record on Thursday when the river crests. They've already blown up a couple of levees, and they're trying hard to figure out which ones to blow next in order to prevent absolutely crazy flooding downstream. There will be some remarkable flooding in any event. Meanwhile, a little further west than that, Texas is suffering through a worse drought than the drought that marked the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s. The fires across Texas are epic. There's been essentially no rain across more than half the state since September. The winter wheat crop is much of it is shot, and in the flooded Midwest, we've only got about 10% of this year's corn crop in compared with what you would normally see 50 or 60% at this point in the season. Now, for a long time, scientists have carefully said we cannot tie any particular event to climate change. All we can say is it raises the odds. But in fact, at this point, scientists are becoming more candid and explaining quite straightforwardly that this is no doubt the effect of a dramatically shifted weather regime. If you look at the Gulf of Mexico right now, sea surface temperatures are about a degree Celsius above their historic average. That's only the second or third time in the last century that they've been that elevated this time of year. And you can tell the effect of that. There's been record heat across much of that area, across much of the south, even though there's been this dramatic cloud cover over most of it associated with the huge storms. The really dramatic numbers are for the nighttime minimum temperatures, which have not been dropping. They've been setting remarkable nighttime minimum temperature records night after night across much of that part of the world. Kevin Trenberth at National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, and one of our really preeminent climate scientists. Boulder's probably the world's greatest concentration of climate scientists, and he's a dean among them, said recently, there is a systematic influence on all these weather events nowadays because of the fact that there is this extra water vapor lurking around in the atmosphere than there used to be, say, 30 years ago. It invigorates the storms, it provides plenty of moisture for the storms, And it's unfortunate that the public is not associating these with the fact that this is one manifestation of climate change. And the prospect are that these kinds of things will only get bigger and worse in the future. And that's what I want to talk about for a moment just here as we end the science section of this slide. The scary part about this, if it hasn't been scary enough already, is that the effects that we are seeing have been accomplished with a rise in temperature of about 1 degree Celsius around the world. A little bit less, about 0.8 degrees Celsius. We've added, by putting all that carbon in the atmosphere, the equivalent of about 3/4 of a watt extra solar energy per square meter of the Earth's surface, okay? Which really isn't that much. It's less than one of those tiny white Christmas tree lights per square meter of the Earth's surface. But it turned out the Earth was finally balanced enough that that extra increment of energy was enough to knock us out of the Holocene, to end this 10,000-year period of relatively stable and benign climate that underwrote the development of human civilization. We've been knocked out of that. The question is how far out of it we are going to be knocked. And the answer is more, for sure. The best guess is there's probably another degree of temperature rise already in the pipeline from carbon we've emitted. The heat is stored for a while in the oceans, but it expresses itself back out into the atmosphere. The real question is what happens after that? And what the climatologists tell us, the same climatologists who dutifully warned us over the last 20 years that we would see more flooding and melting and whatever else, what they warn us, and it is a robust consensus, is that without dramatic action nearly immediately to get off fossil fuel, to stop burning coal and gas and oil, we will see a further 4 or 5 degrees increase in temperature in the course of this century. If 1 degree melts the Arctic, okay, if 1 degree breeds the kind of instability we see in the Gulf, we would be fools to find out what 4 degrees produces. But we will find out unless we act far more quickly than any government or economic actor at the moment is thinking about acting, unless we really bite the bullet and figure out how to get off fossil fuel. So that's what we should talk about, whether or not it's capable of doing that or not, and how. And let me just say, since we're here at a scientific research institute, that the scientific method has proved itself remarkably well in the course of the last 20 years. Scientists have taken a very difficult problem in atmospheric physics and chemistry with all kinds of sequelae that affect almost every other scientific discipline and managed to crack it, managed to use that powerful dialectic that science provides to give us workable answers on what the problem is, how big it is, and what in general we should be doing. The engineering methods worked reasonably well too. We went from 20 years ago with solar panels and windmills and things being kind of fringe technology that hadn't yet reached readiness for prime time, to the point where they're the fastest growing parts of the electric generation picture around the world. Still so small that we would have to immeasurably amp up their pace of adoption in order to make a significant dent. But at this point, it's not an engineering problem anywhere near as much as it is a political problem. And that's what I want you to focus on. As well as the scientific method and engineering methods have worked, that is how badly the political method has worked to deal with this problem. And this country is the prime example. We've had a 20-year bipartisan effort to accomplish absolutely nothing. And it has worked absolutely perfectly. And it reached its apogee or its nadir, depending on how you look at it, about 3 weeks ago in Washington, when the U.S. House of Representatives voted 242 to 180 or something like that on a resolution that said global. They passed a resolution saying global warming does not exist. And we don't need to worry about it. That's one of those votes that historians, whoever the kind of Gibbon is that writes the decline and fall of our empire, will look back on as a signal event. The notion among a majority of our political class that they could substitute their own physics and chemistry for the one used by scientists around the world. that their ideological worldview could trump the actual reality occurring around us. For a country founded in a kind of rationalist empiricism, as this one was, with people like Jefferson and Franklin and Washington at its helm, all of them, you know, men who had thermometers by their side day and night so they could take, if you look at their diaries, they're filled with daily record keeping of just what's going on with the Franklin, the first one to recognize that storm systems advanced in the way we now understand them. For that to have descended to the U.S. Congress, literally stopping up its ears and closing its eyes in the face of tough news is a depressing trend. So let me talk about the work we're trying to do to change things. And here I move from the, for an academic, comforting world of statistic and footnotable fact into the more slippery and elusive world of no one really knows how to build political movements. It's an art far more than a science. It goes wrong at least as often as it goes right. And I, for sure, am just making it up as I go along. I'm a writer by training. This kind of thing, activism and whatever, has precious little intrinsic interest for me. I would far rather, writers like to sit in their room and type. And much as I'm enjoying your company, that's where I would like to be right now. But force of circumstance pushes otherwise. And at some point, in the, maybe when I was in Bangladesh some years ago and came down with dengue fever, a fast-growing mosquito-borne disease now spreading wildfire across Asia and South America. When I came down with it, and when I watched lots and lots of people there dying from it, despite the fact that they had done literally nothing to cause this problem, you can't get a number for how much carbon the 150 million people in Bangladesh emit is a rounding error in our calculations. I think maybe after that it was when I decided it was time to do more than write. And one of the conclusions to which we came fairly early as we thought about that process was that we lacked a movement to force change in this country. We had the superstructure of a movement. We had Al Gore, we had policy people and engineers and economists and really all the answers. The only part of a movement we lacked was the movement part, something to give it heft, make it work, apply some pressure. And we began trying to see if we could build that. And when I say we, at first I mean myself and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury College in Vermont, where I teach. They were seniors, so they weren't done with school, but they were done with school. And we set out to work. We set out to work using, really in the winter of 2008, when Jim Hansen, an old dear friend of mine and one of maybe certainly the greatest climatologist that the world has ever seen, published a paper with his team at NASA that's got to be, I think, the most crucial paper, scientific paper yet this millennium. It said we now know enough to put a value on how much carbon is too much. We look at the paleoclimatic record and we look at real-time observation of things like Arctic ice melt, and what we can conclude with some confidence is any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Full stop. Those of you who read scientific papers understand that that is blunt language, stern language for scientists to use. Sterner still when, as Dr. Schlesinger indicates, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 here and the world around is 391 or 92 parts per million at the moment, rising 2 parts per million per annum. In other words, the paper demonstrated that climate change was not a future problem, that it was a present crisis, indeed the present crisis. breaking over, I mean, in some ways, something not for our children to solve, but that our parents should have solved, you know, that it was already deeply out of control. It was one of the most depressing papers that anyone's ever read. It also, for those of us thinking about how we might build an organization around the world or a campaign, was in another sense a little thrilling. Because the problem one's immediately faced with when trying to figure out how to campaign on a worldwide basis, which we need to do given the global nature of this problem, the problem you're immediately faced with is a practical one. People around the world insist on speaking their own language, which makes it extremely difficult to figure out how you're going to communicate. That was a much bigger problem than the fact that we were a handful of people who had no idea what they were doing and no money or anything else. And the number seemed to us to be a useful way into that problem. You wouldn't normally pick a wonky scientific data point as your rallying cry. It's not as good as I have a dream or something like that. But it has the great virtue in Arabic numeral of crossing those linguistic boundaries. So that, you know, 350 means the same thing in Millbrook and in Moscow and in Melbourne and every place else in the world. Right? And so with that, we went to work. And we started just finding people all over the world that, well, I mean, there were 7 of these kids. So there were 7 continents. Each one of them took one. The guy who took the Antarctic also had to take the internet, because he sort of landmass. And we set out. We started finding people. For the most part, these weren't people who thought of themselves in the category environmentalists, because it's not always a category that exists exactly everywhere around the world. They're mostly people working on enough food for their communities, on public health, on women's issues, on social justice in general, on all the things that won't fare well on a destable, on all the things that no one's working on in Pakistan right now because they're trying hard to get tarps over people's heads instead. You know? And we had told people, we'd organized like training camps, largely for young people. That was one of our tactics. We did one in Turkey for Central Asia. We did one in the Caribbean. We did one down in Johannesburg. We brought a couple of young people from every country in Africa. Most had never been on an airplane before or, you know, left their country, but they were born organizers. We knew that they fanned back out across Africa. We didn't know exactly what they were doing because you can't really Skype people easily there, but we knew they were working hard. And we'd set a goal of a first kind of coming out party for this campaign in October of 2009. And we said we want on this day to get everybody to just take this number and kind of try to drive it into the public consciousness a little bit. Really a kind of slightly odd and goofy and somewhat unprecedented project to kind of take a scientific data point and try to insert it into the public debate. And we didn't really know how well it was going to go. And we gathered down in Lower Manhattan in a borrowed office the week before to put out the press releases and things, but mostly just to wait for a reaction as it began to emerge. And we got the first sense that things were going to go well 2 days early. We got a phone call from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And a girl that we worked with there, a 17-year-old, was one of the ones we trained. She and her sister, her name was Lily. She was on the phone, and she really was in tears. The government just took away our permit for Saturday. We're not allowed to do our demonstration on Saturday like we planned. So we're doing it today, so they can't stop us, and we're really sorry. We were so looking forward to doing this on the same day as everybody else. We don't want to jump the gun, and we hope we don't spoil it for everybody. And we have 15,000 people right now out in the street in Charlotte. And so I was like, don't worry about the date. It's okay. And that was the beginning of a fairly signal weekend. For the next 72 hours or so, pictures poured in from around the world. By the time we were done, CNN had said, I think they counted 5,200 of these in 180 countries, and CNN said it was the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. And they came from all over. From the next picture, oddly, that came in was from completely unexpectedly U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. They made a 350 with sandbags, and they sent a note saying, "We're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking." I will just scroll through a bunch of these. The main point I want to leave with you from looking at this, since you all are part of this fight, and I can tell from the fact that you're here that you're willing and able to take part in this, I want you to see what your brothers and sisters around the world look like who are in this fight. And one thing I want you to notice is that the thing you sometimes hear, that environmentalism is something for rich white people who have taken care of their other problems, turns out not to be true. Most of the people that we work with around the world are poor, black, brown, Asian, young. Because, in fact, most of the world falls into that category, into those categories. And oddly enough, they care just as much about the future as anybody else, maybe more so, because the future is pressing down hard on them at the moment. Okay? So, pictures were arriving from places we'd never heard of. Some of them were coming from places, of course, there were 300 big demonstrations across India. That's the India Youth Climate Network doing great job, fantastic job. Some of them came from places we couldn't identify. That's Buddhist Asia someplace. I just loved the picture. Some of them came from places of enormous poverty. These guys didn't have a digital camera. They're in dugout canoes someplace on the Congo River above Kinshasa. They took a picture and developed it in a home darkroom. It didn't come out too well, so they had to write in what their banner said. But, you know, we were impressed that the T-shirt had penetrated, you know, much less the idea into the proverbial heart of darkness there. Many pictures like that from all over the world. Istanbul, it had epic floods a month or two before. There were 6 huge demonstrations there. Great creativity shown in many places. That's from the Space Needle. That's the colors of the Venezuelan flag. That's an opera tune. Hopefully they didn't stop for too long. You know, just great creative pictures all around the world. One of the things that made us happiest was that for the first time there was tremendous involvement of religious communities in this work. That's the head of Muslim South Africa, the head of sort of indigenous native traditions, and back there in the scarlet is Desmond Tutu's successor as Anglican Archbishop of South Africa at the head of a huge multi-faith march across the city. We had enormous luck with clerics of all kinds. We had a tremendous organizing boost across Central Europe a couple of weeks before this when Bartholomew, patriarch of the Eastern Church, leader of 400 million Eastern Christians, had given a sermon in which, plain-spoken cleric that he is, he said, global warming is a sin and 350 is an act of redemption. That helped enormously, and for those of you who worry about some divide between science and religion, should be a good reminder of the potential power of their combination. That's a Pentecostal school someplace in Ghana. I just like the name of their foundation. That's Billy Graham's alma mater, the most important evangelical liberal arts college in the country, where there would not have been an environmental demonstration a few years ago, and that there is now is a very good sign. I've been in Bethlehem organizing, not an easy place to get to, but the Dead Sea is shrinking dramatically as temperatures warm. People wanted to do something. There were too many military checkpoints in the way to allow a kind of easy collaboration. So the Jordanians said, we will make the 3 in Jordan. The Palestinians said, we will do the 5 on our shore in Palestine. The Israelis said, we're doing the 0. It was a very good day, and it got a lot of press because people were putting aside other frictions for the most important joint challenge that we face. And so there was a lot of that kind of global scrabble, and we were using iconic locations wherever we could. It was a Saturday autumn afternoon in the U.S., so, you know, that's the Syracuse cheerleaders helping us out in front of 100,000 people up there. You know, one of the glories of this winter has been hearing from our friends in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia and Syria, because the same people who organize these kind of things, of course, have been the ones out in Tahrir Square, you know, all winter long, standing up bravely to autocrats, but just everywhere, this kind of quite beautiful stuff underway. Soweto, heartland of resistance to apartheid, they did 350 bungee jumps, but the important thing was they sent a note saying, we strung the bungee line between the cooling towers of a defunct coal-fired power plant. This is the highest and best use for coal-fired power plants going forward. That's my daughter's, just because I'm missing her someplace in there. Those are sap buckets, because our maple forest, as some of the Cary researchers have been finding out in places like Hubbard Brook and things, may not fare too well as the temperature rises. With 300 big demonstrations across China, not an easy place to do this stuff. One of them got busted up by the police, but the others went ahead. That's the China Youth Climate Network making a human wind turbine, and behind them, if you look carefully, you can see the edge of the biggest wind farm in the world there in Inner Mongolia. Just beautiful, beautiful stuff going on everywhere. That's the Student Government Association of the Maldives, which is a country of enormous, it's paradise. There are 1,200 islands sprung across the equator in the Indian Ocean. They're just your vision of what heaven looks like. White sand, palm trees, each surrounded by a reef and a lagoon. The only problem is that the highest point of the nation is about 1.5 meters above sea level. They're in hard luck. It's an entirely Muslim nation. That's their Student Government Association holding a meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate their future. The president of the country, Mohammed Nasheed, a great hero, probably the greatest world leader we have on climate, taught his entire cabinet how to scuba dive. They held an underwater cabinet meeting against their dying coral reef to pass a 350 resolution. This poor country is pledged to go entirely carbon neutral by 2020, and they are building windmills as fast as ever you can please. Picture after picture, just sort of this worked in its way. It was the lead story of Google News for 36 hours, which meant there were more newspaper stories and TV accounts and things about it going on in the world than anything else. And I think we really did kind of take this number and push it at least a little bit into the bloodstream. Partly that attention due to the fact that so many people looked unlike our caricature of environmentalists, okay? That zero up there in Yemen, one of the toughest places in the world, that's all women in full black burqa, okay? A bunch of pictures like that. There's about 15,000 of these pictures altogether in the Flickr account from around the world. But many, many of that kind of thing. Those are oil-rich sheikhs in Abu Dhabi, and they've spent some of their oil riches on building, among other things, the world's largest solar array, which you can see the edge up there in the desert behind them. The world's preeminent solar renewable energy research center is now relocated to Masdar City in Abu Dhabi. Mostly just an inordinate array of pictures from all over the world, including, I confess, 600 or 700 that were labeled in a folder 350 adorable. And they really were adorable, and they really are haunting to look at. Nobody in 1911, though it was going to be a bloody and difficult century, nobody in 1911 could sit down and look at someone and say, that person's going to be a refugee in 40 years. But there's every chance in the world that those girls will be refugees by the time they're their mother's age, you know. The country sets aside part of its meager budget every year into a fund to buy a new homeland someplace else, but no one knows where and you know how it will work. And this culture that's been there for 4,000 years in the Indian Ocean seems entirely likely to blink out in the next 40 or 50. through, of course, absolutely no fault of their own, as usual, the kind of inverse linear relationship between how much of this problem you cause and how quickly you're wrecked by it. I wish I could tell you that all of this had worked to end this difficulty. We did okay. We got to Copenhagen, the big, huge global climate conference, 6 weeks later, and there we convinced 117 nations to sign on to this 350 target, which we thought in one sense was good. I mean, we'd started from nothing a year or so earlier and built a consensus. The trouble is, of course, that they were the wrong 117 nations. They were all the poor ones and all the vulnerable ones and all the rich and addicted ones, led by our own, refused to bite the bullet and get down to work. And so that conference ended in a fizzle. And 6 months later, the U.S. Senate refused even to take a vote on the very mild, tame, modest, tepid climate bill that was before. It wouldn't even take a vote, the Democratic-controlled U.S. Senate at that time. I was worried that in the wake of those kind of things, this movement we were trying to build would just disappear. Turned out people were made of sterner stuff than me. We did another of these great global days of action last fall. It was much bigger than the one before. This time we had a global work party. People put up windmills and solar panels. They dug community gardens. They laid out bike paths. At the end of the day, they put down the hoe or the hammer, picked up the cell phone, called whatever they had, president, prime minister, Politburo. They said, look, I'm getting to work. What about you? You know, time to do it. 7,400 of those in 189 countries. Every country on earth except North Korea was participating. It was beautiful to see. And we need to continue this kind of work, and we will continue this kind of work. The next date for this is September the 24th of this year, for which we need your help. We're calling this day Moving Planet. We officially announced it yesterday, and it'll all be about momentum and motion, and in much of the world it'll be about bicycles. Okay? Because bicycles are one of the few tools that rich and poor both use. And so a beautiful symbol of one of the many solutions that we need, and a beautiful symbol of kind of moving forward. But even if you're not a bicyclist, you can find ways to take part, and I trust that you will. It will be a big and important display of international solidarity, but by itself it will not be enough. And so we need also to be more politically aggressive in this work than we have been in the past. It has become clear, to me anyway, over the last few years, that the root problem is not ignorance on the part of our leaders about what needs to happen. It is cowardice on their part about what needs to happen. Cowardice born from the immense financial power of the fossil fuel industry. That is the most profitable industry humans have ever engaged in. Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money. They announced their first quarter profits today. They're ahead even of that staggering pace. They made $10.87 billion in the first quarter this year. Okay? That tiny fraction of that money in our political system has been enough to pollute and warp it to prevent the kind of clear vision that we need. Are we to deal with these problems? And so, reluctantly, I must say, since I'm not an organizer and I was not by nature a kind of politico, we're trying to take that fight pretty strongly in that direction. And the target that we are taking on and that we need your help with is the biggest front group, lobbying group in the country, a group that spent 5 times more money than the next biggest lobby, a group that spent more money campaigning than the RNC and the DNC last year, and 94% of those funds went to climate deniers running for Congress and Senate. It's a group called the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington. Okay? That's not your local Chamber of Commerce. I don't know about here, but my assumption is your local Chamber of Commerce is just fine. Ours in Middlebury organizes the Chili Festival, and they make sure that all the Christmas lights get turned on downtown at the same day and things like that. They're useful. All right? The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is not like that. It claims to speak for all American business, but in fact, 55% of its funding last year for which we have records came from 16 companies. Thanks to the Supreme Court and their Citizens United decision, they don't actually have to say what those 16 companies are. But it's pretty clear who they must be because they spend their time essentially trying to make sure that the planet warms as fast as it possibly can. They are extremely effective lobbyists. They filed, to give you an example of how extreme in their views they filed a brief with the Environmental Protection Agency last year, a legal brief arguing that they should not regulate carbon emissions because, in part, if the planet warmed, humans would be able to adapt their behavior and physiology to deal with a warmer planet. Not that their 16 companies might adapt their business plan to deal with a world that ran on wind and sun, that all of us, for all time, should adapt our physiology. Now, there are better scientists than I in this room who may have some idea of what those, I don't know what that grow gills. I have no idea really what exactly they're thinking of. But I know that it's crazy talk. If someone came up to you on the street and said their plan for dealing with climate change was you would alter your anatomy to deal with it, you would cut them a wide berth. We need to cut these guys a wide berth. We can't take their money, but we can take a little bit of the undue credibility that they enjoy. And so all over America, we are running this campaign. It simply has businesses and local chambers of commerce say the U.S. Chamber of Commerce doesn't speak for me. And we've had thousands of businesses sign on in the first few weeks, many of them small barbers and florists and pharmacists and things, and many of them large. Apple Computer quit the U.S. Chamber of Commerce over these issues. They're actually one of the more adaptive, innovative, creative companies we've got, and they, I think, are like most people in our capitalist system. Capitalism's genius, at least theoretically, is it's nimble, it's creative, it's adaptable. It doesn't need to stay anchored on the fuel sources of the 19th century. So those of you who own some small business or large, or those of you who shop at some small business or large in the course of the week, you have your homework now. Go to chamber.350.org and help us with this fight. Sign up some of those businesses, raise that total a little bit, and try to start breaking down this notion that there's some divide between the economy and the environment. Start trying to challenge the notion that we're somehow going to have a successful economy on a broken planet, because I can assure you that we are not. If there's anything that becomes clear with each passing year, it's that that's what's impossible. The challenge will be strong in making this transition to something else, but at least it's possible to imagine, in a way that it is not possible to imagine, a healthy, working economy or civilization on a planet 4 or 5 degrees warmer than the temperature we've known for the 10,000 years that we've existed as a society. I'll end just by confessing, since I am at base a writer and kind of condemned to tell the truth as best I can, that there's no guarantee this will work, and there's no guarantee anything will work. And there are scientists who think we have waited too long to get started, and there are political scientists who think the odds are simply too great. One doesn't know. Clearly, we're not going to prevent global warming. At best, we are going to slow it down and keep it from becoming worse than it would otherwise have to be. But we have no guarantee even of that. If you were a betting person, you might be wise to bet that we would lose. So far, we have lost for 20 years. But that's not a bet that you are permitted to make. The clear obligation of a morally awake person when something bad on this scale is happening around them, the baddest thing that ever happened in a lot of ways, the obvious challenge is simply to wake up each day and try and figure out how to change the odds of that wager somewhat. Not with any guarantee you're going to win, but at least shift the odds in the direction that they need to go. And while I can't guarantee you that we will win, I am certain to a moral fault that having spent the last 3 years in constant carbon spewing motion around the world, I'm certain that there are an awful lot of people in an awful lot of places who will fight this fight until the very end. One of the things that's remarkable about that is that a great many of them are in places that have done nothing to cause the problem, and yet they're willing, and I think quite generously, to be in some sort of solidarity with the rest of us, to work side by side with us on this problem. I'm not sure I'd be that generous. I think were I a Bangladeshi or a Maldivian or something, my anger might be at the point where it would be difficult to do it, but they are more generous than that. And I think that that requires a certain kind of response from us. It's always a great honor to be in those rooms full of people doing that work. And it is a great, great honor to be in this room today. And since I know you all are involved in this, just say, I'll look forward to fighting side by side with you as far as we possibly can. So thank you all very, very much.
Bill wants to get on the road soon, but he's generously offered to take a couple of questions from the audience before he must hit the road. I saw your hand first.
Has anybody evaluated the carbon footprint of waging war?
Has anyone evaluated the carbon footprint of waging war? We know that the U.S. military accounts for about 1.5% of the fossil fuel that we use in this country, in all its operations, not just war fighting. Okay? So that's significant, but one of the things it demonstrates, of course, is that the biggest problem that we face, the biggest carbon footprint, is just the things we do absolutely normally every day. Gasoline, 40% of it, well, actually that 1.5% is how much out of the transportation fuel they use, so it overstates how much the military uses in total carbon. But 1.5% of gasoline is used by the military doing its thing. 42% or so is used by people driving cars and trucks, another 15 or 20% by trucks moving goods around the country. So it's very real. One of the reasons, of course, that we end up having to deploy our military in the ways that we do is because we remain tied to this supply of resources that aren't under our control. And president after president gets up and rattles on about energy independence and nothing ever happens. And that's because, you know, in the end, it's not really energy independence we need. We're no better off if we find a bunch of coal in our own country and burn it. What we need is independence from environmentally ruinous fuels. We need to move toward fossil fuel, towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuel, and we're capable of doing it. And I will say, one hopeful sign, if you look around Washington, one of the few institutions right now that's even beginning to catch a glimpse of this is the military, trying to figure out, I think, what their next task is going to be, are working with some diligence to understand the threat posed by climate chaos, because it's a deep national security threat in those terms, but also trying to understand some of the solutions. The military, for instance, maintains about 700 bases in this country and around the world that are at great risk from rise in sea level. And so they've begun to take seriously some of these threats. One can imagine a military, much of whose job was transformed in this century to dealing with the actual big threat that we face. And if we do, it's possible that their technological abilities and organizational abilities would be a help rather than a hindrance along the way. One can at least hope for that.
I'm very interested in fracking, and one of the things about fracking is all of the half-truths and the lies that the industry is not willing to correct. And I happen to think that there's probably a lot of half-truths and lies about the possibility of having renewables. You know, there's just so much out there that it's going to take 30 or 40 years that there's just so many half-truths and lies, and I don't know how you get the truth out there to be able to take action.
Well, look, it's not a lie that it's going to be hard as heck to move to renewables. If anyone tells you that we're just going to, you know, take the internal combustion engine out of the great American machine, toss in a windmill, and carry on as before, they're blowing smoke. You know, it's going to be the hardest thing we've ever done because fossil fuels are absolutely at the center of our economic life. But that said, I think your point about fracking is very right on and interesting, and of course it exemplifies the problems we get into when we're unwilling to really face the challenges that we come up against. The great hope among many was that natural gas, as we were discovering this abundance of it in the Marcellus Shale and elsewhere, would provide a bridge fuel that would let us, well, you know, it is true that natural gas burns considerably cleaner than coal does and produces half as much CO2 per BTU. It's also true, though, as people have begun to note, that that's only when things go exactly right. This new study from Cornell 2 weeks ago, the Howard study, made pretty clear that we were, at the moment anyway, releasing an awful lot of CH4 directly into the atmosphere. And unburned, of course, methane is a more potent greenhouse gas molecule than CO2. So the kind of bridge fuel is looking less, the bridge is looking pretty rickety. And the point is probably that it's time to figure out how we're actually not going to walk off the bridge, but make the leap over that chasm. And we have the engineering to do it. The trouble is the political power of people who are making an immense amount of money in the fossil fuel industry keeps us from ever really gathering ourselves to make that leap. They keep being able to delay. It's not going to be easy, but it's required.
How does nuclear fit into your energy scenario?
Nuclear power is no longer the most dangerous thing we can think of, okay? 20 years ago, it might have been. But with the new coal-fired power plant, nothing has to go wrong. I mean, you operate it according to spec, and it destroys the planet, okay? That said, nuclear power, I think, is going to play a vanishingly small role in the solution to this problem. And the biggest single reason is it's incredibly expensive. You might as well burn $10 bills to generate electricity. And that's even more so in the aftermath of Fukushima, when people are logically going to demand even more safety protections and everything else. All the econometric modeling, no private industry just goes and builds a nuclear power plant. They never have and they never will. You need tons of government money to make it possible. And all the modeling shows that if you're going to spend that subsidy money, you'd be wiser to spend it on windmills and things, because you're going to get more kilowatt hours per your buck than nuclear power plants. I also think that nuclear power sort of exemplifies one of the things will characterize this leap into the future if we make it, is a transition from highly centralized forms of energy to what engineers are calling distributed generation, to a very different model that looks more like a kind of farmer's market in electrons than the sort of Walmart model we have now. You know, everybody get solar panels up on their roof and tie them into the grid. We begin to build out a kind of much more robust and interesting energy network than we have at the moment. Resistant to, I mean, those of you who live near Indian Point, everybody's, at least some of the time, worried about terrorists coming and things, and they were flying F-16s over the power plant for months after 9/11 and things. I mean, I have solar panels all over my roof in Vermont, and I suppose that a terrorist could take an interest in them, and put a ladder up against the wall and climb up on the roof and take them. But if they did, he bashed them with a hammer. Deadly solar particles would not spew off into the atmosphere. And it wouldn't be a crisis, okay? It would be, I would have a problem, but it wouldn't knock down the network. My neighbors, unless there were enough terrorists to, hammer all the solar panels all the same night, you'd be okay. We're going to need to do a lot of thinking in this century, since it's going to be, even in the best case scenario, a tougher time than we're used to. We're going to have to do a lot of thinking about how to make sure that problems stay problems and don't become crises. Okay? That's going to be far more than economic growth or anything else. Durability and resilience and a certain kind of margin of safety and security are going to be the things, I think, on which we place a premium. And it'll take an interesting new mindset to make that happen, but it's the kind of mindset that comes a little naturally when you start thinking about local food, local energy, local everything.
Well, that's a powerful statement with the end of the afternoon. Many thanks again for coming
Thank
here.
you so much.
That's great.